by denigrating several of the signal achievements of modern American history, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act, Rand Paul has performed a useful service for voters who are angry at their elected officials. He has helped to illuminate the limits and the hazards of anti-government sentiment. Wrong. Jim Crow laws were imposed by the government. Someone who opposes all government except for night watchman duties, as Rand Paul does, also opposes Jim Crow laws. This is incredibly simple. Rand Paul happens to have something that ultra-statists of today lack: consistency. Now, he's still horribly inconsistent by my standards by supporting, government monopolies on law, the military borders, and I'm sure there are other things that Rand Paul supports that would make me oppose him. But compared to mainstream politicos, which is to say pro-democracy hacks of various shades, he is the near pinnacle of ideological purity. Many Americans are sputtering mad, believing that government has let them down in abetting a ruinous recession, bailing out bankers and spending wildly. But is Rand Paul really the remedy they had in mind? His views and those of other Tea Party candidates are unintentional reminders of the importance of enlightened government. Nope. Government, a term I don't like being used, in which I, in loose talk, am also guilty of using to mean the state. Government was responsible for the Jim Crow laws, was responsible for the business cycle as we know it, right, by expanding the money supply, sending false signal, causing malinvestments, leading to an artificial boom, which then had to be corrected once the money goes through the system, leading to inflation, leading to a bust, right? And it is obviously responsible for the bailouts. I mean, that's pretty clear. Oh, and the bailouts will only sustain the malinvestments, making the market take longer to clear and prolong the recession. So sorry, all of the headline problems are caused by the state. In a handful of remarkably candid interviews since winning Kentucky's Republican Senate primary this week, Mr. Paul made it clear that he does not understand the nature of racial progress in this country. No, he made it clear that he doesn't agree with the New York Times editorial view of history. And I'm not so sure racial progress is even something to be strived for. Sounds like a euphemism for big taxes and training white people to feel bad for actions done by the state that they had no control over. As a longtime libertarian, he espouses the view that personal freedom should supersede all government intervention. Neighborhood associations should be allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, he has written, and private businesses ought to be able to refuse service to anyone they wish. Under this philosophy, the punishment for a lunch counter that refuses to seat black customers would be public shunning, not a court order. And right, that's the whole point of ownership, is exclusion. The whole point of owning a house or a car is that you get to choose who can use it and who cannot. The whole point of ownership is exclusion. Without exclusion, there's no ownership. If someone can just come into your house and take a nap on your sofa, then you don't own it. And if you don't get to choose who you can exclude by whatever criteria you fucking want, right? If you only want to let hot girls into your house, or you only want to let hot girls into your restaurant, right, you would be discriminating on sex and discriminating based on looks. Right? And if you only want to let in attractive people, right, you're discriminating on looks. And if the only people you think are attractive are white people, or let's say the only people you think are attractive are black people, and you don't want to let in white people, well, do they not own their store? Continues. It is a theory of liberty with roots in America's creation, but the succeeding centuries have shown how ineffective it was in promoting a civil society. The freedom of a few people to discriminate meant generations of less freedom for large groups of others. I'm sorry, but I believe Rand Paul would have opposed state laws which prevented blacks from becoming skilled laborers and which kept blacks out of certain jobs in government places. A free market promotes multiculturalism, as firms pay a price by limiting the customer and labor pools to preferred races.
Firms in the former Confederate states could not keep out blacks on a free market. That's why they needed to get laws to go against the market. We call it the Jim Crow laws. The market tends toward integration into ever larger and beautiful and powerful structures of production that allow man to focus on higher and higher things. To blame the segregation not on the obvious segregation laws, but on the only force in the South that was working against it, the market, is to fail to understand reality itself.
It was only government power that ended slavery and abolished Jim Crow, neither of which would have been eliminated by a purely free market.
Slavery was sustained by fugitive slave laws, right? The slave states actually conscripted people into slave patrols to catch runaway slaves at taxpayer expense, right? The slave owners could not keep their slaves themselves. They didn't have enough force to do so. Required proxy support through the state, and I'll have a link in this in the text version of this to a post on that and why slavery, for the most part, requires a state. There are some instances where you don't need to have a state to have slavery, but in the U.S. at that time period, you definitely needed a state. And Jim Crow laws, I mean, that's obvious. Like, I don't know how you could say that and abolish Jim Crow. Like, Jim Crow refer to laws imposed by the states. So, I mean, to say that, like, you know, only government could abolish what, government laws? I mean, this is dumb.
It was government that rescued the economy from the Depression and promoted safety and equality. Equality in the workplace.
And this is institutional bullshit. There was a dip in the U.S. stock market, which was actually larger as a percentage in 1919 than the one in 1929. But in 1919, the U.S. government was not powerful enough to intervene because Woodrow Wilson had a series of debilitating strokes, which made the government ineffectual, and so there was no intervention in 1919, and so the recession passed in a year. It's often referred to Wilson's stroke as a stroke of luck. Right, because Wilson had a stroke and was not able to intervene, and so the economy was able to go through the recession quickly. In 1929, Hoover met with businesses to force up wages to keep investments in place, and the Fed was constantly expanding credit. Roosevelt came along and expanded on Hoover's policies despite promising in the campaign to go in a more free market direction. In fact, Roosevelt's campaign platform, opposition to Hoover, was against Hoover's, big government, big intervention policies. And in fact, Rexford Tugwell said that that most of the policies of the New Deal were actually just extrapolations of Hoover's programs. In fact, Hoover was the real big pioneer in intervention and cartelization. Roosevelt just expanded on that, and so, but all the seeds were placed from Hoover. And the result of Roosevelt's expansion on Hoover's pioneering interventionism was the worst depression in U.S. history. And the irony, of course, is that, because there was a Great Depression and then there was a lot of government intervention, a lot of people said, well, the market must have really screwed up and only government saved the day. No. You had worse dips prior to this, but they were gone through clearly because the government wasn't sustaining the bad investments, wasn't sustaining the malinvestments through bailouts and through and through make-work projects, which, get people to produce something, but then, once it's done being produced, now what? Anyway, he continues.
Republicans in Washington have breathlessly distanced themselves from Mr. Paul's remarks, afraid that voters might tar them with the same extremist brush.
And right, Republicans are pieces of shit and totally unprincipled, like the New York Times, right? So, whatever.
But as they continue to fight the new healthcare law and oppose greater financial regulation, claiming the federal government is overstepping its bounds, they should notice that the distance
between them and Rand Paul
is closing.
Whenever there's a financial crisis, the remedy is always more control, and more controls which are promised to prevent future crisis. But then another crisis comes, and that's even worse, and then more controls are called for. Same with healthcare problems. You have a healthcare crisis, then there's another program to solve the crisis, and then the crisis gets worse later on. All right. So, two industries that are in straitjackets by the state, healthcare and financials, happen to be two of the most unstable. And to libertarians, this is all very, very obvious. all state action is necessarily arbitrary to some extent. That's the whole point of it being state action. If it was action that was in response to real demand, and action that came about in response to price signals and stuff, it wouldn't need to be a state program. So all state program is necessarily to some extent arbitrary. It's just taking money and then bam, program. And the result is the chaos of the arbitrary.